Hello, and welcome to our webinar on Evolving Community Engagement panel discussion with panelists from around the country. This is our last event for our Fall Tech in the City series. My name is Jerica Logan, and I am the Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, otherwise known as CURA, and I will be your host for this event. If you require closed captioning, you will find a box at the bottom of the screen called CC. Please click the box and select Show Subtitles. This will allow you to see the subtitles during the presentation. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar in the Q&A box. We will ask as many of your questions as we can in the last portion, and if we do not get to your question, we do apologize. If you have any additional questions following the event, please feel free to email me at logan.433@osu.edu. This event is approved for one AICP CM credit. To claim your CM credit, log into your My APA account on the APA website and enter in the event into your online log. There will also be a brief survey at the end of the webinar. If you have the time, please provide your feedback. I am now going to pass it over to our director, Harvey Miller.
Okay, thanks, Jerica, and welcome everyone to our last event of autumn 2022. Again, we're following the theme of tech in this city. How can we use technology in order to manage an increasingly urban planet? And what are the promises and pitfalls surrounding these technologies? Now, before I introduce today's panel, I'd like to take the opportunity to talk about our spring semester series of events. And once again, we have a set of all killer, no filler events here talking about urban technologies and their promises and pitfalls. So on January 27th, we're going to have Ben Green from MIT, who will talk about the smart enough city, putting technology in its place to reclaim our urban future. And you can tell that's a very skeptical view of smart cities. And I've read his book, and it is a rightfully so and very insightful talk about the limitations of smart city technologies. On February 10th, we'll have Jeff Boeing from USC, and he'll be talking about measuring built environments around the world, new insights into urban sustainability and health. And if you don't know Jeff Boeing's work, he uses like massive global scale urban data to measure properties of thousands of cities to look at around the world, to look at their similarities and differences. March 10th, we'll have Peter Norton, the author of Fighting Traffic, but also more recently of a book called The Illusionary Promise, Autonorama, the Illusionary Promise of High-Tech Driving. And then finally on April 21st, we'll have Paris Marx, author of the recent book, Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. And you can tell from those last two book titles, kind of what the perspectives are on these technologies. So check us out. Well, go to our events page, go to cura.osu.edu/events, and you can register for all these events and join us next semester. So let's get to today's webinar. Today's webinar looks at a long-standing and still unresolved challenge in planning and policy, which is community engagement. How should planners and communities talk with each other? How do we engage with a wide spectrum of the community? How do we build shared understanding and consensus on how to move our communities forward? These are still very challenging topics, both in academic and professional planning circles. So about a year ago, in October 2021, senior members of three major planning firms, Connect the Dots Insights, Sam Schwartz, and Nelson Nygaard, co-authored a manifesto published in planetizen.com. It is time for public participation to evolve with transportation planning. And this article is posted at our event webpage. And the idea in this article was, well, we've learned a lot during this pandemic about how people can adapt and change their modes of communication. What do we do going forward? So today we're going to discuss with four of the authors here, the gauntlet they've thrown out and their ideas for paths forward. So it's a great panel here. I'll go ahead and read their bios. All of them are very accomplished professionals and planners. Marissa Denker is the founder and CEO of Connect the Dots. This evolved from Marissa's Fulbright project in 2024, and it now operates across the East Coast of the US and also has a sister branch in Dublin, Ireland. Marissa brings deep experience in engagement design, design thinking, inclusive public outreach, strategic communications, stakeholder management, and project management. She holds an MA in design practice from Dublin University and a BA in urban studies and English at the University of Pennsylvania. She also happens to be an adjunct professor at the University of Pennsylvania and teaches a course on participatory cities. She also co-founded A Playful City, a nonprofit in Ireland that focuses on co-creating playful, inclusive public spaces for all ages. Next, we have Mike Flynn. Mike Flynn leads a transportation planning practice at Sam Schwartz, a top urban mobility and planning consulting firm, where his team develops innovative solutions to some of the most pressing urban development and multimodal challenges for a range of public, private, and nonprofit clients. He has worked for 2 decades in support of sustainable, equitable, and economically vibrant communities across North America and beyond, including a decade at the New York City New York City Department of Transportation. Mike is active in developing, sharing best practices in the industry through the American Planning Association, the Transportation Research Board, the Institute of Transportation Engineers, and as an educator. We also have Teresa Carr. She's an economist, planner, and project manager, bringing 20 years of experience in transportation planning. She's the leader of the Nelson Nygaard Boston office. Her extensive project management experience spans from long-range transportation and public involvement in alternative analysis, environmental documentation under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and conceptual design. She brings highly effective negotiation and communication skills with a proven track record of working with agencies and other stakeholders to reach consensus on controversial project decisions. Her talents also include the right sizing the technical analysis needed to inform planning decisions at different stages of the project lifecycle, and leading engaged multi-purpose teams that have high quality results or achieve high quality results. And finally, Samantha Donovan. She's a senior transportation planner at Sam Schwartz Consulting. She received her master's degree in city regional planning from the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University in 2019, currently based out of Jersey City, New Jersey. Samantha's work focuses on bicycle and pedestrian planning and community outreach. Through completing studies for municipalities throughout New Jersey, she has seen the specific and unique differences in communities in terms of needs, concerns, and preferred methods of engagement. Born and raised in Vermont, Samantha enjoys Ben & Jerry's ice cream, who doesn't, maple syrup, and staring at fall colors. Okay, so we will now go into the opening statements from each of our panelists, and we'll go in the same order. We'll start with Marissa.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. So yeah, as you know, my name is Marissa, and I'm the CEO of Connect the Dots. I co-founded Connect the Dots in 2014 to really address like the disconnect between decision makers and the public and communities and how decisions were being made. We felt that it really wasn't one-to-one essentially. So we really tried to figure out how do we connect that? How do we get diverse voices included in that process? So we were seeing a lot of like tick box engagement at the time, a lot of like public meetings, one and done, and that's called engagement. But we really wanted to reimagine what engagement could be. So engagement that could actually meet people where they are and truly enable people of all backgrounds, interests, geographies to really feed into the decision-making process in a meaningful way. So because we didn't really see it was a core priority in the beginning, we really had to impress. And I kept remembering like we were always like trying to impress the value of engagement. But when the pandemic happened and over the pandemic and kind of the reckoning that our society went through and is still going through, we really started to see a shift and really have been seeing lately more and more public agencies and authorities are recognizing that it's critical to include all voices to really make more robust and inclusive decisions. They're really looking at how do we develop inclusive engagement processes, and particularly ones that prioritize voices that have been left out of the system for years. So in realizing and seeing firsthand, I think, slowly, but starting to see and realize what it takes to do it right. And that's something that we talk about a lot at Connect the Dots is, and what our article also spoke to is how it takes so much, first of all, so much time. And really we talk about like the time it takes to build trust is something that needs to be thought about when we're developing projects and thinking about how that trust continues after a project. So really thinking about how do we build trust with communities, particularly ones that already have a lot of reason not to trust. So kind of starting from scratch in some places. How do we meet people where they are? So what does that take? It takes like some flexibility, creativity, really being able to adapt and make sure your processes are so tailored to each different community, each micro community within that. And also thinking about like investing in capacity building. So how do we shift power? How do we ensure that communities, like there's already leaders in communities, and how do we make sure that they can be part of this process and help even lead processes like this? So yeah, so those are some things that we've been thinking about and that fed into this article. And it's been really great to see more firms like the ones we worked on with this article really thinking in this way too. So having more and more partners that will influence decision makers as well to think in this way and make a difference in the society. Yeah, that's the perspective I'm coming from. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mike, what's your perspective?
Sure. Well, before I was a urban planner, I really started as an environmental and social activist and organizer. And, I'm really interested in how change happens, how social change happens. And now, as I've kind of gone in this career direction for the last almost 2 decades, specifically in how kind of urban development and transportation change happens. An example of that in graduate school for my thesis, it was focused on congestion pricing, but it was really focused more on the public discourse and acceptability and kind of more how people perceive it as a policy, on the disconnect between something that a lot of academics and advocates were saying is a great idea, but maybe, it wasn't clear if the public felt that way too. And I got a little dinged by our department chair that my thesis was more of a public policy than a planning thesis, but that's a reflection, of my interest in the topic. So I've always been interested in how communities are involved in the process of change. But I think as I've gotten older, I've become much more cognizant of who really has a voice, right? When we talk about that. And personally, I've become much more aware of my own ability to be heard because of my background and my, interests or where I'm focused, my economic status, whatever it is. And so, I have my opinions, but really I'm actually more interested in how can we hear from folks who haven't been, who haven't had as much of a voice, kind of what Marissa was talking about. And where I went to planning school at Pratt, there was a strong focus on advocacy planning, right? The idea that we're not as planners imposing our ideas, but rather we're kind of helping communities be heard. But, that said, the last thing I'll say is like, at this moment in time where we see a climate emergency and really an urgency to address it, I think it's not just about like how do we give communities more of a voice at large and sort of create more opportunities just to oppose projects, but rather how do we have a more effective process and how do we make sure those voices who've been more sidelined have a seat at the table, right? So it's more about how we're doing. It's not necessarily that we need to be doing more and more and more, but rather how do we do it better? So that's kind of the perspective that I was coming from here.
Okay, thank you. Teresa, please.
Thank you, Harvey. So my observations on today's topic are from my perspective as a technical person. I'm an economist. I'm a transportation planner by training. I love figuring out how we use data to inform problem solving. And in this sense, I know that data are imperfect. They tell us part of the story, and the other part of the story comes from when we're talking with members of the communities where we're working. And in this sense, I respect the role of public outreach in technical work, and yet usually I'm participating in the role of technical expert or project manager. I'm keenly interested in how we can meaningfully incorporate feedback from the communities into our technical work. And an example of this is at the outset of most planning projects, we explore what we call a state of the system. And that's a grounding of what conditions look like today. And we do this by grabbing ridership data and crash data, environmental data, traffic data, we make maps and we write reports. And we also talk to as many people as we can because the data just tell us what the data tell us. And the people who live and use the system tell us their stories. And those stories are critical to making our project successful. One thing is that when I started in my career as a planner, I was afraid of the public because I was a technical person from Boston living in Oregon. And I felt like if I talked with members of the community, I'd mispronounce a road name, they'd know that I'm from out of town, and they wouldn't respect me. And I got over that by having that experience actually happen. I was working in the community, I mispronounced something, and I was corrected. And yet I was corrected with kindness. And what this person said really stuck with me. And what they said was, it is the community's members' job to give us local context and understanding. And what we bring to this process is technical knowledge and understanding. And it's by working together that we can make things better for the community. My perspective on this manifesto, I've been in the industry for over 20 years now. And I can say that the projects that are most successful, in my opinion, are the ones that get grassroots support from the community. You get that support by engaging all aspects of the community in the process from the very beginning and through the decision-making process. Too often, I've been a part of public meetings that are attended by one slice of the community because due to budget or other reasons, they're held, 6 to 8 p.m. on a weeknight in a location that isn't easy to get to or whatever. The pandemic has opened up some real opportunities for us. Virtual meetings are easier to attend. You can attend from your kitchen or living room or office, or even while you're on a bus. Goes beyond that. I'm a true believer of engagement in locations where people will be, the grocery store, the library, local soccer games. But the tools that we have now are put us in a position of really transforming how we do our work.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Samantha.
Thanks, Harvey. Hi, everyone. I guess I drew the short straw. I get to go last after everybody else. So hopefully nothing I say is too repetitive. Over the past few years, finding any sort of time to reflect has been difficult, and contributing to this piece allowed, I think, all of us to do a bit of that. Public outreach has played a large role in my career so far, and truly is the part of my job I most look forward to. Interacting with community members and helping them feel heard, and just having conversations with people and learning from them has been incredibly valuable. At the end of the day, the community members are the experts on the areas they live in, and we need to hear from them. But when COVID-19 happened, a lot of these interactions didn't exist anymore, and we had to change our strategy a bit. We were all looking for the best ways to create fancy videos or host video calls and create online interactive tools for everyone at home. I don't know about all of you, but I did feel like we were moving into the future of outreach, and I was feeling very tech savvy. But now that we're out and about more, I'm reminded of the importance of in-person engagement, the opportunities to see people's faces and their body language, their facial expressions, the opportunities to speak one-on-one with someone casually, which doesn't always exist in a virtual format. You have breakout rooms, but it's not the same. So while virtual events have their benefits and allow for more flexibility and a wider audience to attend, we shouldn't forget the value in meeting people where they are in person and having those interactions as well. In my opinion, a lot of what we wrote in the article still rings true 1 year later. And the future of public engagement will rely heavily on our ability as practitioners to find the happy medium between virtual and in-person engagement in order to reach the largest, most diverse audience, but also to be able to have meaningful interactions. And back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. That really kind of summarized the whole view of the article from what I had. All of you, your reflections on that. I'd like to pick up on something you said, Samantha. Maybe we'll let you go first this time. Is that you said it rings true, but it seems like even a year ago, it feels like the landscape has changed. So if you were to rewrite it, let's say today, what wouldn't ring true?
I think I think most of it does, but I just think it's important that we remember that just because now we know how to do things virtually and can do it virtually, there is really a very large aspect of engagement that has to happen in person. You know, a lot of people will attend a virtual meeting just to listen. They don't necessarily want to actively participate. So finding people in person, like those are the people that have something to say and want to interact with you.
I'll add to that a little bit. I completely agree with what Samantha just said. One aspect, just in rereading the article, we had in there of hybrid meetings. And I think a year ago, we were like, hybrid meetings are going to be just fine. And yet since that time, right, like people have started to come back, and we've found that there are limitations of hybrid meetings when you have some people that are in the room in person, and then you have other people that are trying to participate virtually. And I think that if we were rewriting this article today, we might recognize that in a somewhat different manner. And Marissa is super creative, and maybe she's figured out a way to make hybrid meetings work effectively, and more power to you. I think instead of hybrid, I might have said something about parallel, right? Like providing multiple opportunities for input so that you do have, as Samantha said, that in-person component and meeting people where they are, and yet also at the same time during the same round of outreach, having a virtual component as well.
Yeah, Teresa, that's exactly what we've been using the word like layering engagement, which is exactly what you're saying. And making sure that way you have different techniques, formats, even like amount of time it takes to give your insight can vary across those layers or parallel lines. Yeah.
So previously we talked about trust in some of your opening statements. I'd like to hear more about that. Like, do you feel like we're at a point now that with these new modes of interaction and new kind of awareness of how people can interact and the possibilities, that we can move towards a situation of greater trust? Because that is an issue, like in some of our local engagements here in the community, and it's a common thing among planners that especially vulnerable communities have kind of like they've heard this before. We've parachuted in and talked to them before. So what's really new here in terms of building trust, I guess, is my question.
I think one thing I'd say, like we talk about like engagement moves at the speed of trust is another phrase we say a lot. And I think it needs to be recognized more, that time that it takes. Like you can't just do a public meeting in 3 weeks, because you need to actually take time to build relationships, understand who's there, even understand if a public meeting is the right format as well. And I think a big part of building trust is like what you mentioned, kind of like the follow-up after. I think one thing we've all talked about together is the fact that, we come in as consultants, all of us, on like a project by project basis. But I think it's about how does the client, like the agency, the city, whoever we're working with, can continue on from where we left off and keep those relationships going outside of projects. Continue to come back after a project, make sure you're consistently following up to be like, here's how we heard you, here's how we incorporated what you said into our decision, here's how we heard what you said, but we couldn't incorporate it, and here's why. So making sure there's that transparency, but also continuing those relationships outside of projects. So the next time a project comes, you already have those relationships and you're not starting from scratch again. And that kind of helps to keep that trust.
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, and it's interesting, especially if you're in the position of either being a consultant who's brought in for a project, right, or if you're someone in government who's focused on one project. But that highlights, Marissa, what you said, the need to kind of look at the bigger picture, even if that's not exactly how it's going to be written into a specific scope of one project, right? But from the public's perspective, it's all kind of the same thing, and that's how you get planning fatigue. I wanted to also just kind of reinforce another thing Marissa said, which is how you build that sense of trust, and I think it needs to kind of, for any individual process, it needs to feel kind of organic, and it needs to feel like it's a real good faith effort to involve folks. And I think one way you do that, which Marissa alluded to, is what I would call almost like pre-outreach. It's where you have those initial conversations, maybe with grass top, kind of community leaders, folks who are connected to what's going on the ground, but who you can kind of reach more easily, right? And just understand, right? Like, what are the historic issues that we need to consider? What, are people's main concerns going to be? What is the right way to engage? Before we even develop a engagement plan, what are those sort of must do's or can't do's or bookends, that are going to help us structure it appropriately? And then, yeah, the other piece is the follow-up, but I would say even just in the process, it's really important to, assuming you're going to have kind of a multi-step engagement process, at each step you need to kind of come back and say, okay, here's what we heard, here's how that's affecting the process, right? Like people have to understand that it's not just kind of going out into the ether, but that it's actually meaningfully affecting the process. So I think those are a couple of key ingredients to building trust.
I love that. And I would add to that something that I heard from one of you in your intro statements, that part of our job is to build capacity, because we are consultants and we have contracts and we work with our clients and with community partners. And part of what we are doing is we are building up knowledge and expertise and providing tools so that the work can continue long after our contract is finished. And in some parts, like it's really fun working with public side clients. You get them ready for a meeting, and then they're the ones running the show, and you're there to answer questions if they need you to answer questions. But it's really their show because they are the ones that are going to have this long-standing relationship with the community. And that extends to the community-based organizations, as Mike was saying, these grassroots community leaders, building the capacity, the knowledge within them so that they are able to continue these processes and these conversations beyond the, whatever the technical problem that we're trying to solve in a specific project.
I want to remind the audience to please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them towards the end of this conversation, or we'll get to them earlier, depending on how many questions are coming in. So let's talk from the city perspective now. First of all, what you're saying sounds good. Different modalities of engagement, but also maintaining engagement over time, not just going from issue to issue and project to project. That seems really time consuming and resource intensive. How do cities do this? I mean, what's a good way to do this? Cities are strapped, of course, budgets like a lot of the public sector. What are some? Do you have any tips for the planners in the audience and city officials?
I could start. I guess I've been kind of on both sides of that, public-private. I think something that I feel pretty strongly about as a best practice is that you do need a single, from an organizational standpoint at a transportation or a planning department, you do need, either a person or a group that's kind of like the, call it the chief information officer, or, a central kind of community engagement and sort of dialogue, one-stop shop, who can kind of see the bigger picture, not only, across projects, but even across the whole department or city or community, and has that bigger view, and can help coordinate to, avoid instances of overlapping effort. But what that translates to is a waste of resources, right? Like if you've already got this one planning project and you're going to be engaging the community, and you've got another one, coming down the pike, maybe there's an opportunity to kind of do it all at once, right? In an ideal world, sometimes there's not, but sometimes there is. So that would be one, concrete suggestion, is really not to, even if you have your planning staff are the ones that are actually developing and implementing the engagement on a project by project basis, I think you still want to have one central person or group that's kind of has that full lay of the land in terms of what's going on, and can help coordinate those efforts. And it doesn't have to be a lot of resources. It could just be one person, but I think centralizing some of that knowledge within a public agency is important. That's one idea.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that can save cost in the end, because otherwise each time a consultant team comes in, we're doing that process from scratch. every single time. And that's a lot of effort up front, especially like kind of like Mike was talking, like the pre-outreach, like mapping the stakeholders, understanding where they all are, who they are. Like if that was information that the client held and could kind of add to at the conclusion of each project and keep it strengthening it, then that would save so much time, I think, and money and effort, that it'd be worth it.
But doesn't this also require boots on the ground? I mean, you have to have people like going to the meetings and at the community events and going to neighborhoods and talking to people. It's not just a matter of like appointing like a community outreach czar within the city government. How does the city manage that? Or are there other ways of handling it?
Okay. No, absolutely. And depending on, where you are, those boots on the ground historically, are either city staff or their consultant staff. But these days you're even seeing more where it's actually members of the community, right? Themselves are kind of recruited and compensated for their time as project ambassadors or otherwise sort of involved, which I think is an interesting thing we can talk more about. But that does take resources, and you need to anticipate that in your budgeting process. And I think it's interesting. I think back to when I worked on capital programs, and every capital project, there were rules of thumb about how much of the construction cost would be the design cost, right? 10%, 20% of the construction cost you need to set aside for design. Maybe we should have a rule of thumb about a community engagement, portion of planning projects. That could be a good, and that way, if you're putting it on your tip, if you're, putting it in your long range plan, whatever, you can make sure that you're putting the appropriate resources to it.
Others?
I'd also say combining projects, like, I mean, even if it's separate projects, thinking about opportunities where you could host a meeting that covers multiple. So that could be kind of one way to think about it, rather than like going back to the same community for like 3 different projects, actually, connecting beforehand and then doing it in a more cohesive way for people. We also did a project recently with the city of Lancaster and in Pennsylvania, and we created like a citizens planning committee. And that was a really cool way to do the boots on the ground part, because they were paid to both help like lead and steer the engagement process through sessions that we led with them, but also to help implement. So they were like hosting their own sessions, hosting their own pop-ups, knocking on doors of neighbors. And it's even a more trusted source than if like the consultant came in and did that, but rather it's your neighbor, it's your friend. So that was a nice way. And that's something that hopefully the city is actually considering continuing even outside, so it's a source across a resource for all projects. So things like that are other.
And I was quiet on this one just because I've never worked for a city, but I can give you my perspective. And I'll start with, I love Mike's idea of having a set aside percentage that should go to public outreach. And of course, it depends based on, lots of different factors. But I know that in my head, I've started to do that on my projects, when I'm budgeting, if something is between X and Y percent, that, it for public outreach, that feels right. And so I think that should be more standardized in our practice. The other thing I will say is, I think most cities, or I hope most cities, understand the value of having a dedicated neighborhood resource or dedicated community resource. I know in many of the projects, I live in Boston, many of the projects that I work on locally, we do have a neighborhood liaison who does all of that boots on the ground stuff. Harvey, that you mentioned, is going to all the community meetings and having personal relationships, right? And building that trust with members of the public who do come to, our project meetings, and that I can say viscerally that makes a difference, having that voice that has been with you, not just for this process, but the past 5 or 6 processes. And something that Marissa said rings true for me for sure, which is there is a cost of not doing this. And that is a political cost. It's a project cost. We've all seen projects crash and burn. And that generally happens when you have not set up a good process. So, you can weigh the cost between what it takes to run a good public process and the risks. Maybe it's less specific cost, but it's the risk of your project not actually happening if you don't.
And how do you broker differences of opinions and conflicts and power differentials in these engagements? Because we've all been involved in these community meetings where a few voices just dominate. So maybe I'll start with Samantha, because she works in bicycle planning. That's always a very controversial topic. What's your experience in this area?
When it comes to like differing opinions, a lot of the times we like to show people the issue firsthand. So in a lot of our projects recently, in order to help people understand others' perspectives, we've been doing a lot of in-person or hybrid or virtual road audits. So there was a project that we did for a municipality in New Jersey, and it was during COVID. So we did do it virtually, but we had a 360-degree camera that went out to this town and looked at a bunch of really difficult intersections. And we actually had a community volunteer who was wheelchair bound. And so we filmed all of these intersections with this individual attempting to cross. And he would narrate it while he was doing it. And there was the sound of the traffic. And we played these to the steering committees, to the public, and listening to this individual talk about his experience and getting to watch it, even if they were like, well, we don't understand, why are we looking at this intersection? There's no problem here. We don't need anything here. They got to see from someone else's perspective the issue, and they were like, oh, wow, like we don't travel like this. Like we get it now. So that's one of the strategies that we've used. And I mean, an in-person audit is way more valuable than the virtual one, but our 360-degree camera with the audio also, it worked.
Okay, that's a clever use of new technology. Anyone else have any good ideas like that? How do we get people to see other people's perspectives, or at least have empathy in these interactions?
I think that's definitely one of the fundamental, hopefully, goals of a good engagement process. And one way to do it is actually in the information that is education, right? It's the information that we share with the people who are participating, about their own community, which sometimes they may just not know, right? Like who they know their immediate neighbors, they may not be as aware of other neighborhoods or other folks that they just don't interact with as much in their day-to-day life. So I think you gotta, it's kind of planning 101, but you gotta reflect out some of the basic facts about the community. And then I think as you get further into the process, it becomes really important for those folks to understand who we're hearing from and who we're not hearing from. If you can measure, right, through your survey or through in-person engagement or whatever it may be, actually compare, from these groups, whether it's by income or different neighborhoods or race and ethnicity, we're hearing these are the priorities, and from some, we're hearing some differences from different groups. I think that can be eye-opening. We had a project in New York City, a citywide plan, where, as you'd expect, a lot of the folks you did hear from in the initial engagement, online engagement, especially, were the folks from wealthier neighborhoods, and were much more focused on biking, to be honest. That was the top priority across the board. And then we did targeted telephone outreach to the neighborhoods that we specifically were not hearing from, that were underrepresented, just old-fashioned telephone-based polling, asking the same kinds of questions. And what we were hearing were the priorities were actually, there was some similarities, but there were also some pretty significant differences. There was much less emphasis on biking. There was a lot more emphasis on transit, for example, and things like personal safety on the street. So, I think reflecting that back to the folks who were more engaged was sort of like a wake-up call to them, like, oh, wow, right, okay, maybe I'm in a little bit of a echo chamber with my fellow advocates, or, folks who are the people that I tend to be associating with. So, yeah, it's tricky, but I think information can be key to that.
Okay, great. I'm going to turn it over to Jerica now, who's going to field some of the questions from our audience. Jerica, please.
Great. I'm going to start with the first question, asking how do you account for the needs and desires of future residents, not incumbent existing residents, and how do you convince residents of a small neighborhood that they have an obligation to share in the infrastructure provision for the entire region?
I can start on this one. So I think, it's a great question. And I think it starts with at the outset of any specific project, we do an outreach strategy. And so I think that we have the opportunity in an outreach strategy, if you're in a neighborhood, but you want to hear from a larger region, to think about the mechanisms for getting feedback and who is going to be providing that feedback. So Marissa mentioned stakeholder mapping is super important for us to hear from the current residents of an area that we are working in. But it may also, if we're looking at a neighborhood that's in transformation, or if we're looking at who's traveling through this neighborhood, or maybe it's a neighborhood with large employment areas or a university or hospital or something, there's a lot of activity. And so we do want to do that stakeholder mapping exercise so that we make sure that we are effectively reaching out to a variety of different users. And then we also want to employ different strategies for each of those user groups. For example, I'm working on a neighborhood project right now here in Boston, where we know that the traditional public meetings work really well for a subset of our stakeholder groups. However, we also know that we are not reaching bus riders. We're not reaching younger people. And so we have different strategies in place to intercept going out to bus stops and, having a survey that's easy to take while you're waiting at a bus stop or while you're riding on a bus, having QR codes available, right? Just different strategies that reach different groups. Public housing, we might have paper surveys in the lobby of a public housing development, and a board, or actually have a person staff a board during a certain period of time. And I think that the way we, to get at the latter part of this question, how do you convince? I mean, I hate that word convince, right? It's more how we're setting the tone of the project and how we're setting the tone of how we're using feedback. And I think that we have the opportunity to make it really clear that we are seeking input from the region, and that we are looking, the specific project purpose and the reason why we're doing the project, and be very clear that we're looking for broad areas of input.
I'll just add one quick thing. Sometimes it's a little more effort, but sometimes you can actually ask people to kind of inhabit some other person, right? And try to see it through their eyes. We did that with our colleagues here on a project in Jersey City recently, where let's say you're coming at it from your particular perspective, but maybe there are newer residents, or it could be any other group really. So you kind of create these personas, right? And you ask folks to kind of imagine that they were them. How would that affect their travel decisions, in the case of transportation? And it's just one way to kind of try to get folks to be pulled out of their, sort of personal viewpoint.
And I think that helps with even what we were talking about before as well, right? Is how do you, like with controversial differing opinions and things like that, how do you step outside of yourself and think in someone else's predicament, how they would feel?
Great, thank you. So our next one says, it strikes me that both RFPs should have more specifications in regard to these principles, and that the consultant teams have an opportunity to distinguish themselves by going beyond the minimum as a measurement of success. Since the article came out, how much of this change of approach have you already started to see?
I have a lot of thoughts on this one. I do think RFPs need to be improved as a whole. I think we've been starting to see a little bit like since the article and in general since the pandemic, we have been seeing more RFPs that do emphasize like we want to see robust and equitable and inclusive engagement. Like those are buzzwords used a lot, but the budget doesn't always match that. Or sometimes RFPs go further to be almost too specific or prescriptive with what that is. And when you're too specific, then that doesn't always, then you're kind of stuck. And like Mark said, you don't really have that opportunity to iterate, to shape it in a more tailored way. But then also the converse is if you have it too broad then in an RFP, then the consultant, should be able to write more about, I think, how they would approach the engagement process rather than have to be prescriptive in that scenario either. Because again, you need to do like what Mike talked about, like a kind of phase 0 pre-engagement to really shape the engagement process. So I guess what I'm trying to say is also, I think RFPs need to be clear on like the principles of engagement and like the level of robustness, I guess, that they're expecting, but not be prescriptive enough and allow for kind of that flexibility once the process starts too.
Thank you. So our next one asks, any thoughts or recommendations for reconducting community surveys? Hard to do this on a very limited budget and with no in-house survey expertise.
I can start on this one. We've had great luck with SurveyMonkey. So I feel like being clear what you're trying to achieve out of a survey. I think that my personal thoughts on this issue are that surveys are a great opportunity to raise awareness about your project. And in that sense, to make it as low a threshold of participation as possible. Big QR code, simple, like easy to answer. I can do it on my phone. I can do it on my phone while I'm waiting for my bus, and oh, there's my bus, it's coming, right? So that means like having it take under a minute. I mean, and of course, depending on where you're at in your planning process, maybe you need to ask more specific and thoughtful questions. But if you're trying to raise awareness about the project, simple, and that doesn't need to be expensive. SurveyMonkey is really easy. And as I said, I've been in this industry for 20 years. And so that means that I'm a little rusty on technology, and I could figure out, I think, how to develop a SurveyMonkey survey. And I think that the threshold for in terms of cost of running it is relatively low as well.
I think it's also thinking about, like what is your best tool? Like Teresa was kind of saying, based on like what information you want to gather, is survey the best mechanism, or are there other ones that could also be an option? Like could a pop-up work instead, or could a pop-up connected to a survey work instead? So really trying to kind of match the insight you're trying to gather with the form you're trying to use.
Thank you. So our next one, it says great information and experience from all of you, and they look forward to working with you. Their question was, if citizens planning task force members aren't elected, but have a lot of influence and outcomes, would it be enough for the public to gain trust to hear that these people were appointed by their elected representatives in a public hearing where public comment was requested?
A super specific question.
Yeah.
I think it depends. I think citizen planning task force, like they're kind of slightly newer, I would say, and I think they've been coming in like different shapes and forms. The city of Philadelphia did one recently, and And that was really, they did an application process. So it was like a public application process. I think the rubric was probably hopefully like transparent ahead of time, but then the idea is that people would apply. So it wasn't appointed. I do think that's probably better when it's not appointed, but I know that there are times where it does help in a way that you're kind of mapping the stakeholders, doing kind of that pre-work that we talked about, and then trying to figure out like who's the right mix to make sure that it's representative across, and having like a rationale behind how you're deciding that and making that transparent too.
And I think transparency is the key word there, Marissa. In getting at the specifics of this question is being able to pull that thread between who's sitting on that board and how that person ended up on that board, and the transparency, or rather that process should not have been opaque, right? You should be able to pull that thread and understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll just say
go
real
ahead.
quick.
Yeah.
No, just as, I mean, as a general point, I mean, I know it kind of goes without saying, but like public engagement, just like any planning process, is a balancing of, you know, the ideal with the practical, right? And in a lot of cases, you're not going to really have the ability to do a perfect process. And I think everything is sort of a balancing act in terms of you want a community engagement process that's credible, that's fair, that's thoughtful, that's good faith, right? That people perceive it was the best it could have been. And by, you know, hopefully by the end, people respect the outcomes of it. Even if, you know, obviously no one is going to be 100% happy every time. But I think it's creating the trust in the process, but you can't really, I guess what I'm trying to say is you can't really create a perfect process. It's always going to be a bit of a compromise, right? So if the people, if the community representatives are appointed, but hopefully you can show that they're pretty representative and that those who appointed them are from, you know, groups that are plugged in, like that, hopefully that achieves a threshold of gaining trust, even if it's not like a full election, you know, or something like that.
Thank you. That was really nice. So I have one more right here that I really want to know. And it says, how do you coach others in your organization, agency to better engage with all impacted communities of a project, not just have those who are already engaged or speak the loudest? So expanding on the practice of community engagement.
I can start on this one if that's helpful. And so something that I always do with my clients at the outset of a project, and so first of all, like when the question asked about like within your organization, and I don't think I need to convince anybody within my firm like how to the importance of engagement. So I'm maybe thinking more of like if I'm working with a client that doesn't see at the outset of projects, I always do a risk assessment. And it sounds really wonky and boring, but I highly recommend them for everyone. They're actually a lot of fun. And you're playing a whole bunch of what if scenarios. Like, let's think about all the different things that could go wrong in this scenario. And it could be cost, it could be environmental factors, it could be process, it could be lack of data. It could be political, and it could be controversies, public controversies. And I feel like through that process of the what ifs, you're not trying to, you know, hit somebody over the head saying you must do things the way I tell you to do them, but rather you're teasing that out in a conversation about what could go wrong if you choose not to engage the communities who would be affected by the project. And so I found that to be a really effective way to go about this.
I think there's a lot of education needed in public agencies. I guess it's, I think when you're in consulting, hopefully, you know, you're in a way your livelihood depends on, this is kind of what Teresa was saying to me. It's like your success depends on trying to show that you're good at what you do, right? That's why people hire you. But I think, you know, in government, you're trying to keep things on the rails and you're trying to deal with day-to-day challenges and move things forward, and it's a different set of incentives. It doesn't always incentivize innovation or trying to rock the boat, right? So I do think that there is a fair amount of education that needs to happen. And what you see sometimes is in communities they haven't done public engagement very effectively in the past. And so it just becomes very adversarial, and it just becomes basically a means of people opposing things, or just the loud voices getting heard, and they already know that's going to happen. And it's sort of like, why are we even bothering? And they don't see the value of engagement because maybe they've only seen it being a not helpful thing. But then it can come back, you know, in the 11th hour, right? When a project gets opposed, or in the long run, when communities stop trusting you at all and your whole agenda gets stopped in its tracks. So I don't have a simple answer for how you educate, you know, around that. I almost feel like you're gonna need maybe some visionary leadership who kind of recognizes that, who takes that bigger view, and says, you know, it's more of a systemic challenge, right? It's more than just we need to do a little more outreach on every project. It's like, no, how do we rethink the way we do it so it becomes a positive, constructive thing, right? Where we're actually building a good relationship and building capacity and having more of an ongoing dialogue with the community. Yeah, I mean, I wish I had an easy solution, but I think it probably, you know, there's a lot staff can do, but in large part, it's also about educating leadership.
Yeah, we've done some of like trainings for city councils before. And that type of thing I think is really important, because it, you know, they can then apply it to their own projects. And I think that's another thing why we've been asked to do training sometimes, is one, like people realizing that their in-house staff needs to understand like exactly what this person was asking about, but also to build capacity, right, internally as well, so that you don't always have to hire consultants. You can have internal capacity even as partners too.
Anybody else on that? And I think if we have time very quickly for one more question, I think I have one here that is very interesting. So how do you tailor engagement differently for rural communities versus with little staff versus more sophisticated urban planning processes?
How do you do this in smaller communities with fewer resources and staff, and also just different issues and stakeholders? Samantha.
Yeah, I guess I can talk about this a little bit. We've done actually quite a few bicycle and pedestrian plans for some of the rural municipalities in New Jersey. And what we've really focused on is using what they already do. So what currently works for them when it comes to reaching their community. So we had one municipality where everybody watched the like local cable channel, like everything was live streamed on it. They posted all these like advertisements and announcements on it. So all of our engagement focused very heavily on using that because they know it works. And then for like rural communities, maybe in urban ones, you would kind of just like go walk around, like chat to people that are out and about, like at a bus stop. You don't have that in a rural community. So we were also very focused on identifying very early in the process, what are some events where we can find people? And we had this very rural New Jersey town that hosted this ginormous car show. And it was a little bit ironic that we were advertising a bike ped plan at a car show, but it worked. And there were so many people there and they were willing to talk to us because they were already at this event. So I think it's really just focusing on what, if anything, do they already do? And what is already going on in this town that you can piggyback off of?
Yeah. Like,
Marissa, we got about a minute left now, so please wrap up.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think like really you can find new resources that they wouldn't even have thought about before. Like in Lancaster City, they had like these red shirts, like trash collectors, and we're like, they can hand out flyers. And so it's kind of building capacity. You don't even know you have it.
Okay, great. Thank you for this wonderful conversation, and thank you, audience, for all these great questions. I think we're wrapping up now. So This is, again, our last event for August 2022, or autumn 2022. And check in with us in the spring in 2023, where we'll have another series of events in this Tech in the City webinar series. So everyone, take care, have a joyous but safe holiday, and we'll see you next year. Goodbye.